This is Judaism Unbound, episode 473, Lost Jewish Books. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're taking a one-week break from our unit exploring American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine because we have an exciting and timely conversation relating to one of our Yeshiva classes, which will begin in less than 2 weeks. The beginning of the next round of our 8-week courses is approaching very, very soon. And the teacher of one of those courses, Ava Mroczek, is today's guest. So before we dive into that conversation, a reminder about what the Yeshiva even is. We launched it in the fall of 2021, and it's Judaism Unbound's digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning. In the first 3.5 years, the Yeshiva has offered over 80 classes, and thousands of students from all over the world have taken them. Students can come from all over the world because all Yeshiva classes take place via Zoom. And they offer a chance to learn about Jewish history, holidays, rituals, and so much more, all from our Judaism Unbound framework that the greatest Jewish tradition is changing the Jewish tradition. That's why it's called the Yeshiva. While we do provide space to explore many traditional Jewish texts and we engage many traditional lenses, the Yeshiva prides itself on offering opportunities to question many Jewish assumptions and broaden our sense of what Judaism means. I won't go into all the details now of this semester's classes. You can go to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn about all of them. Financial aid is available for anyone who needs it, and a link to the financial aid form is accessible on all registration pages. The one class we will go into a lot of detail about today is Ava Mroczek's class, Lost Bibles, Fake Apocrypha. Here's the course description, which is also the introduction to today's conversation. According to tradition, Jewish texts are passed down through an unbroken chain of transmission, from Moses on Mount Sinai through the prophets and to many generations of rabbis. But ever since people started writing the earliest Hebrew literature, they also speculated about other texts that were not part of this official canon. Ancient and medieval literature is full of references to imaginary books, like Solomon's suppressed magical handbooks, thousands of psalms by King David, hymn books written by Job's daughters, and dozens more volumes of lore, both strange and wonderful. Why are there so many imaginary Jewish holy books? What does this tell us about concepts of scripture and authority? And what did these shadow libraries do for the communities that speculated about them? Encountering imaginary Jewish books can reveal a tradition's capacity to boldly remake itself, subvert its own patriarchal structures, and make room for the new and the weird. And now a bit about the course leader, our guest today, Ava Mroczek. Ava Mroczek is the Simon and Riva Spatz Chair in Jewish Studies at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She holds a PhD in Religious Studies and Jewish Studies from the University of Toronto with a focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Jewish literature. Her first book, The Literary Imagination in Jewish Antiquity, won the Sharp Book History Book Prize and was a finalist for the Association of Jewish Studies Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. Her second book, Tales from the Cave, Losing and Finding the Biblical Past, is about manuscript discovery stories, real and legendary, ancient and modern, and is forthcoming in 2026. We've heard from multiple people, including past Yeshiva teachers and Judaism Unbound guests, who asked us, wait, how did you manage to get Ava Mroczek to teach in the Yeshiva? She's amazing. That's true, which you will hear for yourself right now. We're thrilled that she'll be offering her wisdom to Yeshiva students this semester, hopefully including you. And here's a taste. Ava Mroczek, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to jump into this whole conversation because as I'm understanding what your work is about and what your class is about, at least as a starting point, is a kind of orientation towards world building where when you think of world building in like science fiction or fantasy, there's this notion that if you want to create a really realistic world, then there's got to be a backstory to that world. And so there's going to have to be all kinds of books that the characters in the book would have read and all kinds of history that they would have known, none of which actually exists. It's all part of the fictional world that's being drawn here. Now, I'm wondering whether that description of world building connects to the work that you're doing or the things that you're thinking about in terms of ancient Jewish texts.
Well, I think it exactly maps onto that. And in my first book, The Literary Imagination in Jewish Antiquity, what I wanted to do is try to build an imaginary world that early Jews would have inhabited. How would they have imagined their own culture? At a time before the Bible was collected into a canon, right? At a time before we had the idea of a kind of fixed collection of a specific list. What was it like to live in a world before that, right? So what were people imagining that they had that was part of their heritage, part of their culture? And certainly a whole history of text, a whole history of writing was part of the way that they imagined themselves and their heritage. So it wasn't just a sense that, oh, Jews are the people of the book and the book is the Torah or the Tanakh. We have many texts, for example, the Book of Jubilees, which is a non-canonical text in early Judaism.
The best! Shouts to everyone to read it. I'll put links in the show notes.
So I love the example of the Book of Jubilees because it's a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, and it retells the story of the patriarchs. And one of the things that the Book of Jubilees adds in kind of its own world building is the books that those patriarchs would have read and passed down. And as these books kind of get passed down, almost every patriarch becomes a scribe. And there's even this sense that there's a heavenly book up in heaven that is really the true source of all of these earthly books. So certainly part of building this alternative story, you do have a sense that the people who are putting this together are imagining a much, much larger literary world that kind of, that is definitely unbound, right? That is not collected into one place. And it's definitely not available in a single location. They might imagine that they have access to bits and pieces of that written revelation, but they're also imagining that there's a massive amount of other texts that they just haven't seen and that nobody has ever collected.
So I was wondering if we could start with the, let's say, imaginary collection of books that the books that we call the Bible actually refers to. So before our show, I asked Lex, what's your favorite imaginary book? And we actually both came up with the same answer, which was the Book of the Wars of Yahweh, because that was the one that we could remember from the Book of Numbers. Like the Book of Numbers specifically refers to this other book, the Book of the Wars of Yahweh, that describes all these wars.
But it doesn't give the description. It just says the book is
there's this
somewhere.
book that they're referring to, and yet nobody's ever read this book. And there's a real question. Is this a book that existed? Or is this a book that only existed in the imagination of the person who was writing the Book of Numbers? And how do we even think about that? So I was wondering if you could share with us a couple of other books like that we find references in the Bible about them, and we don't know one way or the other, or maybe we do, whether they actually existed or not. And how do you think about those books?
So there's a couple of examples that I really love, and they're really very different from each other. Because one is explicitly referenced in a couple of places, and that is Sefer HaYashar, the Book of Jasher. That imaginary or lost book that's referenced in a couple of places in the Tanakh was in fact written into existence at least twice, right? So it's imagined to have been a lost source for the Book of Joshua. It also seems to be the place where David's lament over Saul and Jonathan comes from. So it looks like some kind of poetic chronicle, but there's no evidence that this book ever existed. It's just mentioned 2, possibly 3 times in the Bible. But as very often happens with imaginary books, they do get written into existence over time. One of the cases in which that happens is a medieval kind of midrashic rewriting of the primordial history. There's a 17th century printed edition in Hebrew of that version of the Book of Jasher, which is then translated into English in the 19th century. And the translators seem to want to present it as the actual ancient source for the biblical texts. Now, the scholarly consensus is that this is absolutely, most definitely a medieval midrash. We don't really know very much about its origins. We just know that in the 17th century, it was printed in Venice. Another version of the Book of Jasher was written by a printer in the 18th century. And these are kind of two different versions of this imaginary book that both claim to be this ancient text. That's one example of a book within a book. But maybe an even more interesting example of texts that the Bible claims to know that aren't known are many thousands of Proverbs of Solomon, right? So in the book of Kings, we read about how Solomon was so wise, right, that his wisdom was like the sands upon the seashore, and he discoursed about all these things about nature, et cetera, et cetera. None of those Proverbs and Songs of Solomon really match anything we have in the Solomonic books, right? Proverbs, Kohelet, and the Song of Songs, which are traditionally ascribed to Solomon. And so both Jews and Christians really wondered what happened to those thousands of proverbs and songs of Solomon. And they had some answers for this. There were actually theological kind of theories about why we only have three Solomonic books, where scripture itself tells us that Solomon was responsible for thousands, right? So Josephus, the first century Jewish historian writing in Greek, he actually changed the thousands of proverbs into thousands of books of proverbs of Solomon, right? He said that Solomon was responsible for thousands of books. And with Josephus, I think this is a really interesting case because often people talk about Josephus as the guy that told us that there was a closed canon. Because in another place in his work, he says that the Jews, unlike those Greeks that have all these books that contradict each other, the Jews only have 22 books. That's it. They follow a reliable chain of transmission. Now, he doesn't tell us exactly which 22 books they are, right? So people have tried to kind of fit in the books that they know into this kind of proto-canonical list. But of course, as we know, 22 is a number of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So what Josephus is saying, he's not actually counting a list of books that he has in front of him, right? The number precedes the list, right? The number is symbolic, so it's kind of a qualitative number rather than a quantitative one.
Right.
Like their books went from A to Z.
Yeah, exactly. It's from A to Z. And by the way, Jubilees does this same thing with 22, although like it kind of does it literally. It gives the creation story of God creating all existence boils down to 22 types of creation, which I think they chose the number 22. And by the way, the Jubilees and Josephus, they're not like the same exact time period. They are close-ish in the general schema of Jewish time in terms of when these things were written.
Absolutely. And they have the same kind of concept of how to express completion and perfection, right? So Josephus is trying to express an idea of kind of the perfection of the Jewish written record as opposed to kind of the messiness of the Greek. But still, people want to put up Josephus as kind of proof that there was this fixed canon, right? Even though he doesn't tell us what was in it, and you can count it in different ways. While at the same time, Josephus also talks about all of the other books that were out there, way beyond 22. So Solomon, literally thousands of books of songs and proverbs and odes. So over time in both, and this is something where both Jews and Christians kind of follow the same idea, that originally Solomon was responsible for all of this lore and all of this writing, but eventually it was cut down. It was edited down by King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah becomes this figure, this legendary figure, who takes on the role of an editor and a censor, as the guy who takes this completely overwhelming number of texts and he selects them. He selects the ones that are going to be passed down. He doesn't get rid of texts that are forged. He suppresses texts that are maybe too holy, that might threaten people's piety, that might be a little bit too dangerous, right? So he suppresses Solomonic magical and mystical and demonic stuff and only allows the parts that are going to be edifying. So we've got that. I mean, the Bible doesn't explicitly say that Solomon wrote all these books, but based on this biblical reference to Solomon's vast wisdom, people kind of interpret it that way. That in fact, scripture is aware of a much larger body of revealed text than itself.
Okay, so I have the experience regularly where I'm trying to convey to people why I think that these reams upon reams of other books, quote unquote, books that aren't just the Bible, books that are ancient, books that communities of Jews cared about. And I'm talking here about some books that we do have evidence existed. But even in addition to those, I don't know whether we call them aspirational books or imaginary books, potential books for future discovery or future forgery, we might say. Like all of that, I get a response sometimes like, okay, Lex, cool. There are other books that were around. They didn't win. And so we have a set of books that are now the Bible. It's cool that there were other ones around, but like, I don't feel called to care that much about those ones that didn't win. There's already so many texts in the Bible. There's also now, all the texts of rabbinic tradition. Like Judaism doesn't lack for texts that are canonical. So like, why are you bothering me so much about the ones that didn't make it? You write in many of your articles that like the Bible, quote unquote, doesn't really exist. I mean, maybe ever, but there was no idea of the Bible, of a canon, during any period in which the Bible itself, what is now the Bible, was written. Like none of the people would have known what you were talking about if you asked them about the Bible, quote unquote. That could be just like an interesting fact at trivia night. Why is it more than that?
The question of why we care about things that didn't win, right? The things that are not part of that kind of unbroken chain of tradition from Moses down to the prophets and the rabbis. Well, the question of why we care about things that didn't win is actually a rabbinic question too, right? The rabbis, in fact, reflect on why opinions that are not taken as halacha, that are not accepted, are still recorded in their own literature, right? So I've started thinking about imaginary books, alternative books, missing books in those same terms. So classic rabbinic style in the Tosefta, there's a moment where the rabbis themselves ask that question and they have three different answers about why differing or contradictory opinions and opinions that did not become normative are still recorded, right? Why do they preserve the losing side? One answer is, okay, so if you preserve the losing side, people will know what not to believe, right? As a kind of negative moment. But there are other reasons that the rabbis give. One is, well, one day the rejected opinion might be relied upon, right? You might need it for later and it might be accepted at a different time, right? This is how a tradition can respond to changing circumstances, right? You kind of record what wasn't accepted because you might want to rely on it at a different time in a different context. And then the third explanation for why the losing side is preserved is to give even minority opinions, even dissenting opinions, a lineage. If you say, your opinion is according to this teacher or this predecessor, you are still including the dissident or the misfit or the rebel in this tradition, right? In this tradition, in this Jewish lineage of discussion. So my sense is that the books that are missing, non-existent, only indexed or kind of dormant, I think it really shows that there has always been moments where the tradition has placeholders, right? Has space for counter traditions, acknowledges paths not taken, paths that might be taken in the future, right? Maybe ideas whose transmission has been interrupted, maybe ideas who have been dormant, right? So indexing, right, these dormant sources, I think it makes it possible for the tradition to expand and adapt. What if we can recover or repair, right, these lost chains of transmission? Maybe we could take up paths that have been previously abandoned. So I think that speculating about and discussing these unknown texts, right, the ones that were lost or suppressed or not officially ratified, I think it really saves space, right, for the return of the rejected, the forgotten, the marginalized, the voices that were not kind of included in that mainstream lineage. So I think that's really useful for a living tradition, right? That has to respond to historical change.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I mean, you brought in the word marginalized. Like the questions that we're talking about, I love this realm of discussion very much because we can talk about some things that are very divisive and hot button in society around margins and center, people being marginalized, groups of people being marginalized, groups being centered, decentered. And we can talk about it at a little lower stakes in a certain sense because we're talking about books. Which books have been centered, which books have been marginalized, which traditions, which texts. But it's actually not lower stakes because when we cherish certain books over time and center them, and when we either marginalize or ignore or even disparage other books, we're making like conscious choices and interventions in Jewish history. So I do want to ask a question. You use the phrase holding space, and I'm thinking actually of Mad Libs, the games we play where there's spaces in the text. But the spaces aren't really empty spaces. They're stand-ins until somebody later could come along and fill in those spaces with ideas, or in this case, with psalms or books that they then claim are sort of the books that are being mentioned. And look, you're the scholar in this conversation more than I am. I can't make any factual or historical statements about what the writers of text meant to do. It feels to me like these references to imaginary books, whether the books existed or not, I kind of veer towards that these books might not have existed in a lot of cases, but simply by mentioning them, mentioning that Solomon has thousands of psalms, it's like, hey, if somebody out there wants to quote unquote discover or find the missing psalms and, do an act of creativity basically, but give it an air of gravitas and ancientness by ascribing it as one of the lost Psalms of Solomon, like maybe not a terrible idea. Like I can't prove that that's what these texts were doing. I'm not going to state that with any certainty, but it feels to me like there's a principle operating here. It's not just that there are books mentioned. It's that by Jubilees having those heavenly tablets, for example, that are still unfolding. You mentioned like each generation kind of writes things into these tablets, and it implies that even our generation might be obliged to write things into those tablets that are unfolding. If we presume that these books maybe didn't exist, what might the goals have been of referencing them?
I think imaginary books, and I agree that for the most part, these books never existed, right? That they're only indexed and imagined. I think imaginary books are about possibility and they're about potential. And they are about opening a space for renewal, right? And in fact, there is a specific line in the Book of Jubilees that all the generations preserved and renewed the books until this day, right? So preservation and renewal are kind of part of the same process. To leave space for something new to be discovered can have negative consequences. And we can talk a little bit about the rumors of Dead Sea Scrolls that might still be available to be discovered, which actually generate forgeries, right? Because that people are looking for Dead Sea Scrolls, and so people supply what the market wants, right? So that's one example of a kind of negative consequence of keeping that placeholder that maybe there's more out there. But maybe I can give a different example of what I mean by preserving a space or of possibility and potential for kind of alternative traditions or alternative voices. And that's one of my favorite examples of imaginary books, the imaginary hymn books of Job's daughters. I love this example because the book of Job itself is actually a champion of an alternative tradition. Job gets put to the test, right? He has everything he needs in the biblical book. He's a rich man, he's a pious man, and God makes a wager with the adversary, Hasatan, who later comes to be identified with Satan, right? This heavenly being, that Job is only pious because he has everything he needs, right? Because he's prosperous. And so in this wager, God agrees to take everything away from Job to see how Job will react, right? So Job loses all his wealth, all his children are killed, and he gets stricken with this horrible, embarrassing skin disease. And then his friends start to tell him that he actually deserves this because our ancestral wisdom that has been passed down through the generations says that the righteous get rewarded and the wicked get punished, you reap what you sow, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, this is not true, as Job knows from his own skin, right? He knows that what they've been taught isn't right. So the book of Job itself is a kind of challenge to that. Now, hundreds of years later, a Greek Jewish writer wrote something called the Testament of Job, which is a retelling of the story. And in the Testament of Job, what happens near the end of the text is that Job gets taken up to heaven. He gets a revelation of his new celestial life. What's left behind when Job is taken up to heaven is a revelation of hymn books to his daughters. And this is really unusual because we don't often get books ascribed to women really in this whole tradition. But in this particular text, Job gives a set of chords to his daughters. His daughters start speaking in angelic tongues, and there's a revelation of revealed text that we never learn what it is, right? We don't know what the content of these books are, but the reader is directed to these particular hymn books. If you want to know what was revealed to the daughters, you will find it in the book of Cassia, etc. Now, you won't, right? These books don't exist.
Yet. I'm going to say yet.
Yet. What I love about this tradition is that these hymn books of Job's daughters don't have a lineage. They're not passed down from anybody. They're not an ancestral patriarchal text, right? Unlike the ones in the Book of Jubilees that get passed from patriarch to patriarch. This is a brand new revelation to these women. And the text takes great pains to say that it is to the daughters and not to the sons. Job has 7 sons who get his earthly possessions, but otherwise they're totally ignored, while the daughters get this new wisdom and preserve it in these books. I love this example because it offers a new idea, like it offers an alternative to a kind of passed down ancestral wisdom through fathers, right? Through fathers to sons. And here I think that the suggestion, right, that these new revelations ascribed to women that are really that are not part of this chain of tradition, that even the biblical book of Job starts to reject, I think that really offers the sense that there's potential to imagine authority in another way, right? That there's always been alternatives to imagining authority and always been alternatives to imagining where wisdom, where revelation comes from.
For some reason, I find myself thinking about a conversation I recently had with my dad, who was talking about this author. He said he was a very brilliant man, a very amazing person. And I said, well, Dad, did you read the book? He said, oh, I only read a few pages and I didn't like it. I was like, well, then why are you saying that this guy is so brilliant? He said, well, he wrote a book. And that there's something about, the actual writing of a book that I think is very impressive to people. I find myself thinking about the Northern Kingdom as a place that there must have been writing there. There must have been books. Archaeology tells us that the Northern Kingdom of Israel, right, which was destroyed 150 years before the Southern Kingdom, before the first temple was destroyed, that it was sort of the more urbane kingdom, the more probably the literature was well developed. Maybe the literature of the Southern Kingdom was written by refugees from the Northern Kingdom. And so you imagine that there would have been a literature there, and we don't have it. And I'm wondering, are there imaginary books from the Northern Kingdom that I just don't know about? Or how do we even think about that realm of the imaginary books that we don't even know about?
Oh, that's a good question. I would direct you to my colleague Andrew Tobolowsky.
A past teacher in the Onion Shiva. We love it.
and I think here, I'm not sure about the imaginary books, but certainly the tradition of the lost tribes, right, as a sort of alternative history or counter history is very powerful.
Well, it's funny because I was actually involved in the translation of an Israeli novel called, in Hebrew, Malachim Gimel, the third book of Kings. In English, we ended up with the translation, The Secret Book of Kings. And it's a novel written, 15 or so years ago, that purports to be the story of the Northern Kingdom in a positive light, as if it were, in a sense, as if it were a book written, a sacred book.
Which, just to
written.
clarify, what we have in the books of Samuel and Kings is very much from the perspective of the Southern Kingdom, and the Northern Kingdom looks very bad. So it's sort of like Wicked, but the Bible.
Yes.
Right.
Without the music, although it would be great if it had a musical version.
Well, I teach a class on gender and sexuality in the Bible, and one of the assignments that my students are supposed to be writing right now is a rewriting of a biblical text from the perspective of a minor or missing character. And one of my inspirations for that is, of course, The Red Tent,
Right.
by Anita Diamant, who rewrote Genesis 34 from the perspective of Dinah and made it into a love story rather than a story of violence. The wonderful thing about the Bible, which I try to impart to my students, is what it doesn't tell us, right? There's so much missing that we would want to know. And that's where the space is, right? That's where the space is for interpretation. And Jews have been doing that for thousands of years.
Yeah, and years ago when I was working with Yochi Brandes on the translations of some of these novels, I started to feel like, whoa, maybe this is what actually happened. Like, it actually is kind of convincing in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And I said to Yochi that happened to me. And she said, yeah, that's what always happens when you write a historical novel. You start to feel like you might actually be discovering some truth. And on a certain level, you are, right? I mean, in the sense that you're intuiting the deeper truths, not the historical truths, but you might be sort of channeling a sense of the deep human truths that are found in every work of literature. But I wonder how you think about that work, like Anita Diamant's work on The Red Tent or other contemporary work that, in a sense, is writing those hidden books today versus some of the stories that you were telling us about, books from the medieval period that did that, versus the books that really are from the ancient world that actually exist or that we are pretty confident once existed, versus those imaginary books. Like, do you see them all as in a similar realm, or do you see them as fundamentally very different because the ancient ones are actually ancient, or at least were in the minds of ancients, and so they play a different role in our kind of historical thinking about Judaism?
That's a really good question. And I've been reading around comparatively to see how the imaginary books that I'm looking at that are mentioned in the Bible and also in early Jewish and medieval Jewish literature, are they part of a kind of broader human literary tradition, right? So because we have a ton of early modern examples, there's even entire catalogs of imaginary books in 17th and 18th century France and Italy. And of course, modern writers, Margaret Atwood, Umberto Eco, of course, Borges. The Polish sci-fi author Stanisław Lem wrote several reviews of books that don't exist. And I think the difference that I've seen is that the books that are part of kind of this new project I'm doing on imaginary, pre-modern imaginary Jewish books, the difference is revelation, right? Because these books that I'm thinking about are in some way sacred. They're in some way part of a broader culture of revealed text. And what does it mean when such a large part of what people imagine to be revealed text is unavailable? What does that tell us about the nature of revelation? How does that allow us to think differently about the canon itself, right? Because one of our kind of rabbinic cliches is that everything is in the Torah, right? Turn it and turn it, everything is in it. But in fact, the way that pre-modern Jews imagined the whole revealed world is that we have access to only a tiny part of it. And that's the case even long after what we think of as the canon of the Bible was set.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about this conversation with how the flow of at least rabbinic Jewish history went, because there was like a decision to be made, right? Like a potential decision was to say the Torah is not everything. And when I say the Torah, I don't just mean the 5 books of Moses. I don't even just mean the Bible. Like Torah as a category is not all human wisdom. And
Right.
so it's important for us religiously to strive for forms of wisdom outside of that, beyond that, from all sorts of corners that are not generally sacralized as a kind of Torah or a kind of like official wisdom. That could have been one route. The other route, and I think this is more what was taken in most respects, is to say Torah, the word, We need a capital T and a lowercase t because there's such a broad set of meanings for it that Torah, yes, it means revealed tradition, but it also means like the rules for which shoe we're supposed to tie first in the morning, generated in the Shulchan Aruch like only like 500 years ago. Like we're going to say Torah is a really expansive category, but I'm going to quote Noam Chomsky actually, who says that the best way to I'm going to get this slightly off. Like the best way to restrict debate is to actually allow for full unrestricted debate within a narrow category of opinion. And I think what Jewish history did is it took a pretty narrow set of textual modalities of kinds of Jewish learning, and it pretended, in my view, that they're so vast and they incorporate every possible kind of learning. But they're not every kind of learning. And you see that the second you dive into books deemed apocrypha or books deemed not canonical, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, this can be a kind of Jewish text too? It's so different. Like, I don't even feel like I'm reading a Jewish book. What does that reflect about how we define Jew? Like, it's interesting to think about that. And what I keep on coming back to with your framework of imaginary books, we've used words like forgery or fake. And to be clear about that, there are people that come along and write a text. They say dishonestly that that text was actually written thousands of years ago. And that can be a problem because if people were to think that they're actually thousands of years old, we would come to misunderstandings of history. Like a lot of bad things could happen. And I do find myself flashing to math class in high school where I had been told for years that there is no square root of -1, that's kind of gobbledygook. And then I learned that there's an entire category of numbers called imaginary numbers. And the square root of -1 does in fact exist. Now this gets to what does exist mean? But there are actually all sorts of practical ways in our universe where you have to use quote unquote imaginary numbers in order to figure out how things in physics operate. I think that's true Jewishly too. I think things that are imagined, things that are imaginary, turns out a synonym for them in math, or roughly a synonym, is complex numbers, complex texts. What if we thought of these fake or forged texts? And again, I'm not saying that people should lie about their texts being older than they were. Although Jewishly, there's a big old history of that. We could look to the Zohar. We could look
the Zohar.
Like there's a lot of people who have written things, called it 1,000 or 2,000 years older than it actually is, and been seen as prophets or seen as visionaries. What might that teach us in our present moment? Why might understanding these imagined books, not so much as fake, even though it's in your title, but rather as complex or energizing, be important?
So was it Maimonides who said, hear the truth from whoever speaks it, or something of that sort? I think our question is, why have we privileged origins so much, right? Why is the defining feature of something being important or authentic or meaningful who wrote it and when, right? What happened that has become kind of the defining reason of why we should take something seriously? There's a really interesting example actually related to the Zohar that even in some of the Kabbalistic literature a few hundred years after the Zohar.
And sorry, to fill this in, because I didn't actually spell it out, the author, Moshe de Leon, was certainly writing about 1,200-ish years after he claimed the characters wrote it, Shimon Bar Yochai being the claimed author.
So Shimon Bar Yochai, there's a great story of Shimon Bar Yochai and his son being stuck in a cave for 12 years, and several stories about how the Zohar was suddenly turned up, right, in medieval Spain when it was, in fact, written by Moshe de Leon. Now, in some of the early modern Kabbalistic literature, there's actually some awareness that this is not true, right? There's some awareness from where there's a report that Moshe de Leon's own wife said, look, he didn't have an ancient manuscript that he was working from. He was writing this out from his own head and heart. And then they just sort of drop it. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference to whether they accept the Zohar or not. But there's very often a sense that the stories that are told to create a provenance for a new text, that even as they're told, there's a sense of doubt, right? There's a sense that, oh, this is a story, right? We can, even as these provenance stories are told, they're already presented as not necessarily reliable. But that doesn't seem to be particularly decisive, right, for whether the text itself is accepted or not. So there's been quite a lot of work on this, especially in Second Temple Judaism. And my own supervisor, Hindi Naiman, actually wrote one of the formative books about the history of pseudepigraphy and the way that Jews would continue to write in the name of Moses or in the spirit of Moses. She's someone who resisted the idea that we should call these practices forgery. If we say that anything written in the name of another figure is forgery, we would have to consider much of the Bible as a forgery, right? Including the book of Deuteronomy, for example, right? Placed in the mouth of Moses, but written much, much later. Parts of Isaiah, of course, are ascribed to Isaiah, but written at different historical stages. The idea of writing in someone else's name, right? The whole concept of pseudepigraphy, false writing, has to be considered differently from the way that we would consider forgery kind of at a time of, of copyright law, of intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. So writing in someone's name is not so much forging a text, but erasing yourself in order to become part of a tradition that's bigger than you. So rather than forging a Mosaic text, rather than forging a Davidic psalm, you are taking your place in a kind of long lineage of what Naiman called Mosaic discourse, or you're channeling the spirit of David. You're extending the work that these great heroes are known for.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the story that Lex told me about it a little bit before we came on, but I hadn't known about it, that in the Book of Jubilees that there are these heavenly tablets that the writer of the Book of Jubilees is kind of receiving from, but the Book of Jubilees isn't the totality of what's in those heavenly tablets. Mm-hmm. And that just feels like a very powerful metaphor for what you're talking about, this idea that the Torah, if we might call it, I mean, the truth with a capital T, right? Or whether you, again, see that in a kind of spiritual or a supernatural way or just in a natural way, just the idea that we're all kind of channeling truth, but that exists kind of both outside of us and inside of us. And right. De Leon saying that, or De Leon's wife saying that he was in a way channeling this, even, and that it's both kind of a forgery and not. I find very fascinating. And I'm wondering whether the Book of Jubilees is the main book where we find an idea like this, or maybe there are other ones as well.
Well, I think it's all over the place. I think that many texts, both in the Bible, right, and outside it, have evidence that people are imagining a much, much larger library, right? A library that is only partly reflected in anything we might have access to. One of the things that's actually counterintuitive about this is that sometimes when we have references to texts that we think are just obvious, like let's say Ezra reading the Torah in Ezra Nehemiah, those references might not be exactly what we think they are. They might not be completely identical to the text that we now call the Torah. So in a sense, those references could be just as imaginary, right? Just as imagined as the text that we don't actually have. In any case, the heavenly tablets seem to be a kind of source, right? Seem to be a heavenly source for the things that the Book of Jubilees is communicating. But there's all these different layers of mediation. There's the angel reading or dictating from the heavenly tablets to Moses, but the Book of Jubilees isn't identical to what Moses is writing, and what Moses is writing isn't identical to the heavenly tablets. So I want to point to a sense of humility here. I want to point to this idea that even the ancients didn't have a sense that they had access to everything. Scholars are always lamenting that our record of the past is so fragmentary and so much knowledge has been lost, but this is a very ancient complaint. And for us, it's often a complaint. But for pre-modern Jews, it was also an opportunity, right? Because if something is lost, if something is inaccessible, what if we might find it again? What if it might be just around the corner? So for instance, one of the stories about how the Zohar traveled through time, right, from this legendary origins in the 2nd century cave of Shimon Bar Yochai, is that it was found in a cave by some tradespeople, but by some Ishmaelite traders who used the pieces, who used the leaves of the text to wrap spices that they were selling. And then the pieces of the text ended up in the garbage, and a scholar from Tzfat went and picked through the trash to put those fragments back together. Right? So the secrets of the ancient world, the secrets of Revelation, can be found anywhere. Can be found in a dank cave. It could be found in the garbage dump.
I'm flashing to a conversation I had actually with another person who's teaching with us this semester, Shulamit Tita, and we were joking, but by the end of the conversation, we weren't joking anymore. We were serious. It's kind of like what Dan described with you write a story that's fictitious at first about ancient times, and then you think that it's really what happened. And we were talking about, like, what if we just went into a bunch of synagogues, took out the Torah scroll from the Ark, and substituted in one that had Jubilees for Genesis. I mean, it has a little Exodus too. Like, what would change? What would happen? Like, and by the way, we're not going to do this. We're not going to like steal a bunch of Torahs. But I think the creative exercise of what would shift if we actually took the literally lost books, like books that are imagined, books that we have no evidence ever existed, or the figuratively lost. Like Jubilees wasn't lost. We have it thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls findings, and also thanks to Ethiopian folks who preserved it in Ge'ez. But like, this is non-trivial for how it could impact Jewish life today. And so I'm finding myself thinking about another way of vandalizing arguably Torah scrolls. Like, there's this idea of white fire, that the blank space in the text, there's the black fire, which is like the actual words that are on the page, and the white fire, which is like the space between. I've often joked that like the white fire is a call for us to like doodle and add our drawings and add our marginal comments and create new fill in the gap kinds of takes, new Mad Libs on these texts. And when I first said that, again, I was kind of making a cute joke. And over time, I've been like, what if we actually built a Jewish world where that was an assignment collectively, where we were like, okay, here's the list of imagined books from the Bible that are actually referenced. We don't have any of them in textual form. What if we split up global Jewry and like each country gets a book and like they have to generate some cool Torah for it? Or I don't know, like that feels to me like the Judaism Unbound kind of future that we're imagining. I'm wondering like if people are hearing you and thinking, wow, this might plant a seed for me to do something or for my community to do something. Do you have ideas for what those somethings could be? I know you're a scholar who focuses on a few thousand years ago, but for the right now, how might people take these notions of imagined books, lost books, and maybe imagine them or find them?
I love this question more than I can say. And I think one of the ways we can think about it is to remind ourselves of a historical fact. Jews were writing scripture long after the so-called canon was closed. And if we're no longer thinking of the imaginary books that are written into existence, for example, the Sefer HaYashar, as forgery, but as continuing a tradition, then I think that continuing to write scripture in the spirit, right, of our predecessors is something that we can continue to do. Now, it's less controversial to say that we can continue to write midrash. People do it all the time. If we think about places that are held in the tradition for thousands of additional Psalms of David, right, that Second Temple scribes added to, that Syriac-speaking Christian scribes also added to, and also Islamic poets added Psalms of David into new and expanding traditions. What is the cutoff point, right? Is it late antiquity? Is it the Middle Ages? Is it early modernity when many of these missing or imaginary texts were written into existence? Why? Why is that the cutoff point? What would happen if we took the challenge of the hymn books of Job's daughters to think about alternative sources of wisdom and alternative sources of authority, for example, that come from women and that are not passed down through patriarchal chains of transmission? One really interesting example of taking up kind of broken chains of transmission and repairing them and rediscovering them is the book of Judith. Judith did not become part of the canon of the Tanakh, but it was taken up by medieval Jews and became a really, really important part of Hanukkah, especially, right? It became connected to celebrating Hanukkah. So I think that's a really interesting precedent that these kind of non-canonical traditions, we do have precedents for them returning. We do have precedents for people trying to repair and recover those broken chains.
I love that you just use the verb return because, of course, Judith, there's no moment in history where Judith was recognized as part of the canon. And yet I do think it's fine and praiseworthy even to say that canonizing her through the holiday of Hanukkah is a kind of return. It reminds me of Muslims, actually, who don't use the word convert primarily, or at least many groups of Muslims. They use the word revert for somebody who becomes Muslim.
And many Black Jews do as well.
And somebody could look at that in the way that people look at newly constructed text and call like forgery, quote unquote, right? In the way that your advisor was saying we should rethink forgery. Like revert, return can have a variety of meanings. And this goes to what you said about origins. There is not one true factual origin point of Judaism from which everything else springs. Like that's the contention of, at least me, I think it's the contention of Judaism Unbound, but like that's not sad to me. What that points to is that we have an incredibly rich, diverse tradition that should probably be called traditions, plural, but we've consciously chosen to call it one coherent thing, even though it isn't one, because it's valuable and special to see all these wildly, radically different texts and different peoples and different traditions as being in conversation with one another. That's what looking at lost texts, looking at marginalized texts can do. It also is why, from my perspective, it's not only cool and interesting to uncover the past ones, it is imperative, not for me, okay. Like sometimes I find myself saying, it's okay for us to generate Torah. Like we generate our own new sacred wisdom. You used scripture, I might use Torah, but maybe your point is that we should think beyond just Torah. Like we don't just have the chance to maybe do that. From my perspective, that's like the sacred responsibility of every generation of Jews to like contribute our new texts to the library, contribute our new creations to the toolbox of meaning making. And so you mentioned you've asked your students to do this. You've asked them, minor character in the text, generate something. I would presume you didn't say like generate Torah. I might say that. I'm with you that we should go beyond midrash. Midrash is a submissive word. Midrash implies that you are secondary to a more holy text. And I think that's why generating midrash is not so controversial, because in doing so, you're actually you're propping up older texts that are already recognized. What I want to do is prop up our own new work and call it something other than midrash. So what are some of those things that your students or you have generated? Practically, what does it look like when we create those little micro Torahs?
So as a scholar and as a historian, I look for precedents. What I've seen in the pre-modern texts that like to speculate about these alternative sources of authority and wisdom, right, is that the official chains of authority, the canon, has never had a full monopoly. There have always been voices that point somewhere else. Even if those other sources are only imagined, even if they're just out of reach, they still really insist that, a different world is possible. So over the years, my students have really generated quite a lot of work that take the position of people who don't get centered in these stories. So one really popular character who gets short shrift, of course, is Hagar. So I've had several rewritten texts that actually tell the entire story of that cycle from Hagar's point of view. that became an example that speaks to something that the biblical scholar and comparative literature scholar Ilana Pardes tried to do in her book from the 1990s, Counter Traditions in the Bible, where she tries to excavate the suppressed voices and kind of the evidence of counter traditions, right? Of people who do not get to be the main characters, but who we can still listen for, right? We can still discern some traces or relics of those perspectives that were not centered. And the idea of other books, non-canonical books, lost books, missing books, inaccessible books is, I think, structurally a similar way of bringing in alternative sources of authority and tradition.
So thank you so much, Ava. I'm actually flashing to a conversation that will be in a podcast episode coming soon. It hasn't been released yet, but we recorded already, so this is a little confusing. A sneak preview for a future episode for the listeners out there. But I'm flashing to a conversation we had and that will be released with Amichai Levi, where he spoke about a Passover Seder tradition of his, where he, a long time ago, had half the room act out the story of the Exodus from the Israelites' perspective, and the other half act out the story from the Egyptians' perspective. And that it was a really moving, powerful experience. I think we could and should do that with almost every ritual we have. Not because I think every hero in the text we have is actually a villain and every villain is actually a hero, but because that ritual choice, that ritual act of turning it for everything is in it, flipping around how we explore this story, I just believe is always going to unlock new things. So I'm really grateful for that. Can you take us just a little bit into what your class is going to look like? How will folks be navigating, journeying through these books that are lost and imaginary? Because I presume the syllabus is not week 1, this book that is imaginary or lost, because obviously we don't have it. So What is the class going to look like?
Each week I am planning to go into one imaginary or lost book. And we're going to assume that this book is in some way real, because it is real. Even the imaginary books have a real impact, right? What does the existence of this book tell us about the culture and the imagined worlds of the people who were speculating about it? Was it written into existence over time? Because many of them were. And what does it mean? What would it mean to imagine this book as part of our tradition? I have a whole selection of imaginary and lost books. The books of Adam that are passed down through the generations. What would it mean if that became kind of a central piece of Jewish culture? David's 4,050 songs, and we're going to look at David traditions in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because all three traditions kind of imagine new Davidic texts into existence. We're, of course, going to talk quite a bit about Enoch and the heavenly tablets and the Sefer HaYashar. And we'll talk quite a bit about Solomon, whose books, according to legend, were suppressed not because they were forged or fake, but because they were in fact too important and too authentic and too dangerous for normal people to have access to. And I think what I'll end with...
Normal in quotes.
Exactly. Sorry, you can't see my fingers. What I'll end with is a modern example, and that is what happens when scholars, contemporary scholars, imagine lost Dead Sea Scrolls. Imagine that there are still Dead Sea Scrolls out there that we might be able to find. And in fact, as some of your listeners might know, there have been quite a few fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls that were bought for massive sums of money by the Museum of the Bible in DC and by a few theological seminaries in the United States, all of which turned out to be fake. Now, how did this happen? And one of the ways that this did happen is that there was a market created by the speculation, by the contemporary legends about missing and potentially recoverable Dead Sea Scrolls. And some of the stories about how scholars have created these legends themselves are really, really wild. So we're going to go through kind of the contemporary history of these imaginary books that lead to actual forgery and deception.
Thank you so much, Ava Mroczek, for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Can't wait for the class. Thanks so much for having me on.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A fun surprise This will only be announced on the podcast. It will not be in written form on any website anywhere or in show notes. There's a discount code that you can get for this class, Lost Bibles, Fake Apocrypha, that you can only learn through the audio that you just listened to and are about to hear. So the discount code for 10% off in this class is not forgery. All capital letters, NOTFORGERY. No spaces, all capital letters, not forgery. We talked about that earlier. It's not just forgery. We ascribe authority in different ways, etc. That's the code to get 10% off. We hope that you will register for Ava Mroczek's amazing class. And if you'd like, check out our other classes at judaismunbound.com/classes. Financial aid is available for all who need it. If that 10% discount code is not enough, you can apply for our financial aid via any of the registration pages for any of the classes. So the last thing we'd say is that we really appreciate when you're in touch with us. You can do so via any of the following platforms. There's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other goodies. And last but not least, you can always email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.